This Quietcast podcast is brought to you by the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast.
Hey Brian, do you know anyone that was once a teenage fundamentalist?
Oh, Troy, you know that I was, because you and I have a podcast called I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist.
Ooh, Brian, I sense the Lord at work here.
He works in mysterious ways.
So tune in to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, the official podcast for the Azusa Street Revival.
I'm not quite sure that's true, but it is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Liminal, a word 1,000 miles wide but small enough to fit into the present moment. It describes an in-between place. We live most of our lives within this space, not quite ever arriving at our idealistic final destination. We spend so much of our energies on our best impersonation of who we wish we were, until we can't. But in sneaks a dark night of the soul, or perhaps a mystical experience. Our way of being has an error loop introduced. Today we call that deconstruction. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we teach you how to be here, how to traverse these spaces, and where we can go if we remain humble, open, and honest. Welcome to another episode of the Liminal Living Podcast, where we explore the spaces in between, the edges of faith and the depths of human experience. I'm Tom Rundell, your curator of conversations, and today we have the privilege of diving into a wonderful, wonderful deep conversation that touches on some of the most profound challenges and opportunities within our spiritual and religious spaces and our emotional and physical lives. Our guest today is Chuck DeGroat, a therapist, professor, an author, a pastor who spent decades working at the intersections of spirituality, psychology, and community. He has coached numerous pastors and church planters, and his work has been instrumental in helping many navigate the complexities of their inner lives, particularly in the context of leadership, narcissism, and the healing journey. His books include When Narcissism Comes to Church, and his newest one that's coming out soon, Healing What's Within. And these offer deep insights into the ways in which our spiritual and emotional health are intertwined with one another. And we get into that today, where we talk about the effect of trauma on our physical bodies and the effect on our religious and spiritual life as well. And what happens when we internalize that trauma and when we use that trauma to kind of further our churches when we practice the art of narcissism. We talk about that quite a bit as well. Chuck brings this huge wealth of wisdom to this conversation, and he offers perspectives that challenge us to look deeper, to question more, and to pursue healing in ways that are both spiritually and emotionally robust. So whether you're tuning in for the first time ever, or this is a long-time listener, you are welcome here. You can bring your certainty, you can bring your doubt, you can bring your questions, and I invite you to lean into this conversation with an open heart and an open mind, and let's step into this liminal space together and have this conversation with Chuck DeGroat. How do you pronounce your last name? I have heard it a couple different ways.
Yeah, DeGroat.
So, DeGroat. All right, That's how I've been doing it.
Good.
But I listened to a podcast earlier today, and they said DeGroat, and I was like, DeGroat? I don't think that is.
Yeah, there. You know, a lot of the folks in this part of the world spell their last name DeGroot, and and so I think it was actually changed back in the day to OAT because that's really how it's supposed to be pronounced. So.
That makes sense. All right. Well, Chuck DeGroat, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. It's awesome to have you here today.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom.
Well, fun fact, we have a mutual friend by the name of David Rice. And back in 2019, he asked me to speak at his church, and he was covering your one of your first books, Leaving Egypt, Finding God in Wilderness Places. And I had just finished up a dissertation on the liminal spaces of the wilderness in the Bible. So it was kind of fun. That was the first place I encountered you.
Wait, tell me about your dissertation. Where'd you do that through? Like, what did you do?
I did, the title was Liminal Spaces, A Narrative Spirituality of the Bible. I did it through Portland Seminary out in Oregon. And Normally, Mary Kate Morse oversees that program, but when I was going, she was on sabbatical. So, but I did the spiritual formation and leadership program over there.
Yeah. Yeah. Great.
So,
Yeah. Wow. So interesting. Yeah. Well, so there's some overlap in our work.
yes, yeah, you're a spiritual director. I'm a spiritual director.
Yeah.
You do a lot of that inner work exploration, and I also do that. So there was some overlap, and I was like, man, I gotta talk to Chuck, because I think we're gonna be like two peas in a pod or something, because you just cover a lot of the same stuff, but just from this different angle that I just find really fascinating. So I've been excited for this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, you live in Holland, not too far from my house. Actually, you work in Holland. You live in Grand Rapids.
That's right.
But I got a quick question. Where is the best place to live on the planet, and why is it the shores of Lake Michigan?
Oh, well, I grew up on Long Island, the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, the southern coast of Long Island. Lived in Chicago, lived in Iowa, Chicago, Orlando, San Francisco, and here. And there's just a unique beauty to this particular part of the world. And you know it well. I don't have to sell you on it. But I feel like when people ask, oh, well, you live in West Michigan and you lived in Florida and you lived in San Francisco, I'm like, yeah. And isn't that great? They don't realize the beauty, the beaches, the dunes. I mean, you just travel around Michigan, you go up to Sleeping Bear Dunes and the crystal clear water up there. The small city kind of feel of Grand Rapids and all the great coffee shops and pubs and restaurants and things like that. But I do miss, and this may hurt you deeply, but I do miss my salt water and my waves in the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah.
What do you miss about the saltiness? Because we kind of brag ourselves about the saltless sea.
I know. I think it's sort of like body memory stuff. It's like that's what I knew as a kid. And so when I first started, dipping my toes and getting deeper into Lake Michigan, I was like, where's the salt and where are the waves? Yeah.
And where are the sharks and where are the jellyfish?
There's that, which is incredibly positive.
Yes. Yeah, but that sea is also pretty rough with those waves that can get really, really rough.
Yeah, it can.
Yeah. Well, you've kind of lived all over the place, and you've done like just so much work of the inner life. And what is the soil that your life grew up out of, and how did faith play a role in that?
Yeah. Well, I think the soil was mixed, right? So my folks grew up in New York City, and as many white families did, they were married in the late 50s. I didn't come along till 70, but they were a part of the white flight movement out to Long Island, New York. They weren't Christians, but when they had this kid in 1970, 14 years later, they thought, well, it's probably a good thing to get him baptized, because that was just what you did. And So I remember Peace Lutheran Church. I remember the eternal light, like the candle I didn't understand how this candle would never go off. And I remember the communion table, and I remember these very visceral sort of embodied sacraments, elements of the liturgy, and all of that felt very mysterious and very magical. And so there was this kind of rich imagination of faith, but there was also brokenness in my parents' marriage. There was a lot of pain. There was a lot of verbal violence, I would say. And so there was this mix of what should have felt like the safest place on earth, and my home often felt very disorienting and disruptive, and yet this very mysterious, and I think this is probably what led me into Christian spirituality, the contemplative tradition, but this very mysterious apprehension of a God who was near in and through these mysterious symbols back in the day in my church, right? This candle that I'd stare at for, that never goes out. Why doesn't that go? My first sip of wine at the communion table in 5th grade after, I went through, what do they call it? Confirmation? What was it in the Lutheran Church? Now I'm blanking. Whatever it was.
Was it the catechisms?
It was like a catechism or a confirmation. It was something like that. A communion class that I had to go through to take my first communion, and that sense of kneeling at the altar and sipping from the cup. It was all very profound. So it's a very interesting soil because there's this deep embodied spirituality and also a profound sense of disorientation at the same time.
And you have like that sensory experience of like taste and the flickering flame and all that going on. Now, as you like aged on, did you stick with the Christian faith, or did you kind of like walk away from it at a time?
No, I stuck with it, and I became a pretty righteous kid within it. And we found our way to a Reformed church because we had the last name of DeGroat, and when we were visiting churches, the Dutch Reformed elder happened to say, "You are DeGroat, you belong here," and so there was that sense of, oh, I guess this is my tribe. I didn't know, none of us realized we had a Dutch last name, or so there were these things that started to emerge in my sense of faith identity, and a Dutch Reformed tradition that became very important to me, and pastors within that tradition who had a particular read of Scripture and a particular kind of certainty that a young kid like me grasped hold of, particular doctrines and a particular way of understanding us versus them. The frozen chosen is what we were called. And so, faith stuck, but faith did stick, but it became, if you know the work of The Critical Journey, Janet Hagberg, that early sort of mystery and curiosity quickly turned to a kind of certainty and rigidity, I think, in those early years, particularly my teenage years, where I felt like, well, I had landed in the true church. Like, I'm one of the 0.00, 3% that have been chosen by God before the foundation of the world. What luck.
Yeah. And now you've landed in Grand Rapids, which is like Dutch Reformed Central. Like,
well, it just reaffirms all of it. So I'm kidding.
You came home.
I came home, yeah.
So when was a moment when you started to question all of that, like foundational stuff, and what sparked it? Yeah,
so that began in college for me. In fact, I went to a Dutch Reformed college, but it was a college with a much broader imagination of Scripture, and I was introduced to different ways of understanding Scripture. I was introduced to the theology of Leslie Newbegin, which was pluralistic and in some ways felt more universalistic. I was introduced to liberation theology. I was introduced to sort of a wider Christian ethic, and there was something about that was profoundly disorienting at one level, because I was so certain for such a long time in those early years. And so I know I was wrestling during that time. There was a lot of it that was really intriguing. And at the same time, in the years after that, I found my way to a seminary in the Reformed tradition that was pretty certain and would affirm some of my old certainties. And yet I continually encountered personal experiences of God and understandings of the text that were much larger, broader, and more imaginative, that left me, again, disoriented. And as you often say, in that sort of liminal kind of space, didn't quite have words until 1997, when I took a class in Christian spirituality with a professor overseas in England, where I was studying at the time, who introduced me to the mystics. And suddenly there was this more expansive language for one's experience of God, and a broader tradition. Like, I thought, I was reading Catholics, and I thought, well, they're all damned to hell. I can't read them. And suddenly I was finding more grace and more richness and more curiosity and more luminosity in the contemplative tradition than anything else.
Yeah, those I was really drawn to John of the Cross and his Ascent of Mount Carmel work.
Yeah.
That's probably one of the top 10 books that helped shape my understanding. But yeah, if I would have given that book to this, 17-year-old me, I would have been like, no, you need to burn this thing because they're Catholic. And,
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So now your professional life develops. Is this, you're a counselor, a spiritual director, a teacher, an author. Is that something that you were kind of aiming for? How did that develop?
No, all of that developed in a way that, sort of reveals the mystery of the journey, and how much we're not in control. Because I was aiming toward doctoral work. In fact, I had gone over to England to get the blessing of a professor to do biblical studies work with a scholar named Richard Bauckham in apocalyptic literature. And what I discovered sitting in a library for 6 weeks was, number one, I was really lonely. And number two, as I understood apocalyptic literature, in particular the book of Revelation, it was written for people in the midst of suffering. And I thought, how disconnected am I from that right now? Like this is a very pastoral book. I didn't realize apocalyptic could be pastoral and speak to suffering. And yet I was in the basement of the Bodleian Library, and I had the sense that no matter what happened, I needed to find my way to places of pain, places where I might know a bit of suffering. Little did I know that I had a lot of suffering in my own story. So I ended up sitting down with the professor of counseling at my seminary, who, when I said some of this stuff out loud, just kind of looked at me with a smile, like, you're just clueless, kid. Don't you know what you're asking for? He, in that conversation, he named some of my pain. He named some of my impact and my potential impact if I continued in a way of denying my own story, my own pain, my own wounds, my own emotions. And I still remember sitting there with a puddle of tears on the floor because I was weeping. And he said, I would like you to step into, not do PhD work right now, but step into our clinical mental health counseling program here at the seminary. And that was a transformational program. He was connected to Gerald May, David Benner, Gary Moon, Brennan Manning. And so I got the full immersion, not just into like clinical mental health counseling, but contemplative spirituality and spiritual direction.
Wow, man, what a story! That just took a 180 really fast.
Yeah, right.
Like you're in a basement studying apocalyptic literature, and now
Yes.
you're in clinical psychological classes getting your training. That's wow, that's amazing.
Yeah,
and that connection with like your body and the sensations and like that needing to know like suffering, the effects of suffering on the human condition.
Yeah.
That's something that you're not going to encounter in just your cerebral spaces in a basement of a library.
I hope to. Like, it was more philosophical at the time, and I was a classic Gen Xer listening to all of the alternative music at the time and sort of mired in my own existential despair. But I certainly didn't want to feel it and deal with it,
Yeah, just let them sing about it in my brain, and that'll be fine.
Right.
Now, a few years back, you wrote this really great book called When Narcissism Comes to Church. Why did you write that book, and what were you seeing or experiencing that called for such a need?
Yeah, so there's a story behind that book that really goes back to those days. I think in part my own narcissism, which has shown up in various ways throughout my ministry career as a pastor, therapist, professor, but also as I did my own work and as I began to sit with others in the midst of their pain as a pastor and as a therapist. So, I don't end up doing PhD work. I end up stepping into a church staff and sitting with people. Well, by and large, I was in conversations with women who were sharing stories of harm and abuse. And this was in the late 1990s in a more complementarian context. And I didn't quite know what to do with all of it. I didn't have the categories. Much of what they were talking about didn't involve physical harm, sometimes sexual harm, but oftentimes a more vague kind of experience of abuse. And I remember having to dig around to find a book that would name the phenomenon of emotional abuse. And so I was really mired in stories of pain and abuse that were contradictions, in the midst of a church that talks so much about the goodness of God and the health of our community. What I would be privy to behind closed doors, as most of us are, who are spiritual directors and therapists, are the darker stories, the more painful stories, and then holding those contradictions. And then, as you know, they do something to you. They impact you too. So that's a long way of saying, the story of when narcissism comes to church is born out of that. And then of course, like I began doing church planner assessments, pastor assessments. I was in a church planning denomination where I was very much engaged in conversations around church planning. I just saw the damage multiplying all over, as they were trying to multiply these churches. I was like, you're multiplying pain and abuse and trauma. So I was seeing a lot of the pain.
Yeah. I tried to run in the church planting circles for a few years, and I realized this is not for me. I'm not cut out for that kind of work. But something I noticed when I was at a church plant, not as like planting it, but kind of in a support role, in a spiritual formation capacity. We went to this church planters conference down in Florida, the Exponential Conference, and you got to bunk up with all these other church planters, and they're exchanging resources. And I was in charge of formation, so I'm really like pouring into small group leaders and trying to form them spiritually, and I'm writing curriculum and doing all this stuff. And this church planter, he's like one of those parachute planters where you drop in, you build something, you move on. And he asked me, "Oh, what are you using for spiritual formation in your church plant?" And so I started the long description of what I've been doing, and I just watched the glaze over. The eyes just glazed over, and he's like, "Oh, you're not going to give me a book that I can just hand to somebody to just kind of like plug into my church. You're actually, using yourself in your
doing
your
embodied
stuff."
work.
And that's when I think that was a light switch for me. Like, I am not cut out for this place, and this thing. And I've noticed that this narcissism, like, it's very pragmatic. It gets the job done, especially in church growth strategies and in church spaces where Christendom is like losing authority, it's losing trust. It just seems like the go-to tool to build something. What are some of the things that you've noticed, like the collateral damage, when we tend to lean on narcissism to build or maintain a church community? What have you seen?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's narcissism is always devouring in a sense. It's always more, and so it's voracious, and I think within a church context, it's more, better, bigger, faster programs, growth, and there's I'm a therapist too, so I often talk about autonomic nervous system states. There's a sympathetic nervous system charge behind it. Go, 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 go. And that comes at a cost. That comes at a cost personally for the planter and those who are in that state. It comes at a cost for the church that is in go mode, and what we lose. What your question was? What do we miss? What do we lose? What was?
Like, what's the collateral damage?
The collateral damage, yeah. Because I think what ends up happening is, at first it feels appealing, right? It looks sexy. It looks it's the shiny new thing, but we're not designed to live like that. To grow under those conditions, Transformation, I don't think ideally happens under those conditions. And so people often feel used up and spit out. I mean, I know many people who've been parts of church plants and felt very core to the work until they were no longer useful.
Mm-hmm.
I've because I've been involved with church planters from the early formational stage, I've watched a lot of them with good intentions and good hearts who'd actually been immersed in some good resources and practices as they grew in terms of their platform and the size of their church, become more and more disconnected and alienate people who are closest to them, and end up stepping on them, hurting them, bullying them. And that's been really sad too. You know, the collateral damage is almost, I mean, it's myriad, like too much to talk about, right? I mean, it happens in all kinds of big and small ways, but, you know, at the heart of it is a profound sense of alienation, because I think the church planter is alienated from himself or herself and ultimately alienates others, which is strange because what they're talking about is connection and building and more people. But what you find is that it's anything but deeply relational or deeply connected or deeply transformational.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just in the church planting world, but you know, pastors in general tend to lean on. I'm sure that narcissism is not like a light switch; you either have it or you don't.
No,
but there's like a spectrum from like a full out narcissistic disorder to like narcissistic tendencies.
Yeah.
You know, and pastors tend to lean on those tendencies.
Yeah.
When does it cross the line to become like really unhealthy, and when is it, if ever, appropriate to kind of use them?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain, I mean, I've been doing assessments for 20 years, and a good and high number of pastors test with some elevation on the church planter or on the narcissistic spectrum. And so whether church planters or pastors, more church planters than pastors test high on the narcissistic spectrum, but fewer test into narcissistic personality disorder, right? And what I'll often say is if there's a good awareness of that, I'll say, you know, what this might represent is a part of you that sort of developed, albeit from some of the wounds of your life, but with some capacity to sort of push through, some drive. And as long as you're aware of your wounds and aware of these sort of adaptive coping capacities that look a little bit like narcissism, you will be okay, you know, because when you do invariably, you know, step over someone or step on someone, and they say, ouch, you'll be able to say, I'm so sorry. I see what I've just done. And you'll be aware of your impact. So there's something about it. I don't want to judge all of it as being bad, right? I do want to honor and acknowledge that there are some who, you know, have some elevation, who do some really good things in ministry when they are self-aware. It's those, the ones that tip over into narcissistic personality disorder. Generally, there's very little capacity to see their impact. They're really cut off from any sense of self-knowledge. In other words, this persona, this narcissistic sort of part of them, persona, has grown to be so inflated, and it's so compensatory, which is to say it's compensating for pain or wounds beneath it, that they're deathly afraid of the loss of this, you know, this false self, as Thomas Merton might say. And so they'll protect this false self at all costs.
You mentioned Merton. He's my homeboy. I love Thomas Merton.
You and me both.
His work, Inner Experience, is the first book I ever read from Thomas Merton.
Yeah.
That's another
Good
one
place
that's on
to
my
start.
top 10.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, just the chapter one, first two pages was mind-blowing for me, about the one who seeks to be a contemplative, wishes to, you know, like cultivate contemplation in himself, but then ends up just making contemplative faces at himself in the mirror, and then he thinks that his experience of himself is an experience of God. Like that phrase like hit me hard, because you can take out the word contemplative, put in church planter, you know, put in successful leader, put in whatever you want. We want to see these things within ourselves.
Yeah.
And it seems as though people are are drawn to these like narcissistic, charismatic leaders from maybe places of like shame or places of insufficiency in themselves. And they say, well, if I can't be that, I'll surround myself with somebody who can. Do you notice that there are people who are drawn to narcissists in an unhealthy way? And what does that look like in a church setting?
Yeah, there's a CIA profiler of all people who's written a bit on the dynamic between the narcissistic leader and the follower. And he says, the narcissistic leader is mirror hungry. In other words, the audience, the congregation is the mirror, and the follower is ideal hungry, which is to say there are certain needs that are met by following the narcissistic leader. And I get that as one who has fallen for a couple of different narcissistic leaders. There was, my default was a bit more shame and insecurity growing up. And I found that when I plugged into men in particular who had more confidence than me, I failed to see some of the lines that they were crossing, or the blurry boundaries, or the ways in which they were harming or hurting others. What I knew is that it felt good for me to be aligned or to be connected to that particular person. And so oftentimes you'll see this collective phenomenon happening in congregations. One person, small groups of people, whole congregations that are ideal hungry and who plug in because it's we, our church, we're doing the discipleship program. We're doing the evangelistic ministry in the city. God is doing something in our midst. There's something that people feel. It meets needs. And so I have some empathy because I think, what we're talking about are people who are hungry and who have particular kinds of needs that need to be met, but aren't being met in the ways that they should be met, if that makes sense. That was a lot of word soup, but...
Word soups are great.
Yeah.
That's kind of the phenomenon around Mark Driscoll in the early 2000s. I got caught up in that, and I listened to all of his sermons. I was like, this guy's the greatest thing ever. And then to watch it fall, to listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, and like that was really when I started to really deconstruct this whole like Christian masculinity thing. You wrote something about hypermasculinity on your Facebook page. I thought it was really clicked into this. Do you mind if I read it?
Oh yeah, sure.
You said hypermasculinity is the rotten fruit of disowned shame. Behind the mask of grandiosity, a little boy hidden and desperate. We settle for caricatures of these men, but I'm always moved in therapy sessions when the maskless little boy emerges in tears, longing for love.
Yeah.
Do you think that we're drawn to authoritarian leaders because of that insufficiency, that shame that has just never been dealt with? And what do we do about that if it's so?
Yeah, I think part of it is that they seem invincible. They seem superhuman at some level. And for those of us who follow, we're all too aware that we are human and limited and fallible and needy. And so, I know people who are closely connected to Mark Driscoll in the ministry. I don't know him personally or that situation. I would never diagnose someone I don't know, but there seems to have been a phenomenon there where people plugged into this man that seemed larger than life, almost superhuman, certainly had a kind of a presence to him and really zero vulnerability, I know men in particular, men who I've worked with, said in the midst of my own shame and my own insecurity, to be around Mark or to be connected to his work, felt like I was a part of something. And I really get that. I have a lot of empathy for people who, because that's my story too, so there's something there, but on the flip side, the hypermasculine man, he's insecure and ashamed too. He's just run from it. He's part of what I discover when I do this work, and I do some really long-term therapeutic work with men like this, is that there's invariably a story of profound pain, trauma, abuse, powerlessness. And they'll tell me, yeah, well, we'll get there eventually, but they'll tell me, when I was 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, I was sexually abused. I was forced to do this. I was bullied in this way. And there was a little part of me that said it will never, ever happen again. And they don't quite know how it happened, but they became the bully. They became grandiose. They sort of took the vow to never, ever let themselves experience pain again.
Gosh. Yeah, I know that Mark is getting a following again, and I know some people that are getting close to him and attending his church and loving what's going on there. But it seems like it's just the resurgence of that hyper masculinity.
Yeah.
And
it'll never get old, and because it goes back to Genesis 3, right? And we see it all throughout Scripture. So it's like, it's not. People always ask, when did this start? In the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, and the 80s. I'm like, no, you can trace this back, to the Reformation era. You can trace it back to Constantine. You can trace it back to Saul and David, the Tower of Babel. You can trace it all the way back.
Yeah, and it comes from like these wounds that we experience as a kid, and that's what your new book seems to be about, is healing what's within. And does that build on your previous work of narcissism in the church? Is it meant to be like the follow-up?
Yeah, there were a few who wanted me to do like a Narcissism in the Church Part 2, and I really didn't feel interested in that or called to that. I was really curious about, because this is my own story, how do we heal? If we've been hurt, if we've been harmed, there's a lot of things that happen to us that we don't have a whole lot of control over. And I think, with a lot of the folks that I've dealt with and worked with in the midst of this narcissism conversation, they experience particular kind of harm at the hands of a pastor in a church or an organization or wherever it might have been, where they didn't get the justice that they wanted, or they got the justice they wanted, but it didn't settle them in the way that they thought they would be settled. They were still struggling with anger, disappointment, rage, confusion, disorientation. So for me, the shift is toward what's happening within. Gabor Mate, the Vancouver-based physician and trauma expert, he says trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens within you in the absence of a compassionate witness. So I'm really interested in what happens within us when we settle, when the pain grows to the extent that it grows into trauma, and we don't have anyone walking with us and bearing witness to our pain.
I have not heard that definition before. Yeah. And that, gosh, yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Now you talk about your inner dashboard. You said if you listen within, you'll notice your story. Yeah. The story your head, heart, and body are telling you. Where did you get that image of that inner dashboard? Yeah, well,
I was thinking about it in terms of, we so often talk about our symptoms, but we don't talk about what's beneath our symptoms. So I wanted a shorthand. I wanted a way of talking about what happens within that use some shorthand that people could have some access to. And so came up with this idea of this personal dashboard, like a car dashboard with 5 spots on it: our thoughts, our emotions, our body, our behaviors, and our interpersonal relationships. And sometimes those flash yellow, sometimes those flash red, but the scattered thoughts or the judgmental thoughts, the emotions of sadness or rage, the embodied experiences of sleeplessness or IBS symptoms, the behaviors of addiction, the whatever it might be, the interpersonal relational styles are all pointers. When we start seeing those yellow lights and those red lights, it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. It's like your check engine light is coming on and you've got to look beneath. And so that was it for me, is like, how do we begin to, well, first of all, let's just stop there, to take seriously the symptoms. And I was writing the book not necessarily as like a trauma manual, but as a way of talking about how we bear trauma, not just in a contemporary sense, but going back to this ancient story from Genesis chapter 3, how we bear trauma, how it shows up in our bodies, and how we begin to name it. So one of the things I did there was I said, in a sense, what King David is doing in Psalm 38 is naming what is popping up on his personal dashboard, because Psalm 38 has it all. It's the thoughts and the feelings and the body sensations and the interpersonal consequences and the behaviors. It's all there. And so if it's good enough for King David to name, it's important for us to name what's happening within us.
What are like if we're keeping an eye on our dashboard, what are some of those symptoms that we are like need to be like looking out for in these 5 different areas? What are some of the like immediate ones that just pop into your brain? Like look for this, look for this.
It's so subjective, right? But like when I'm talking to people in ministry, they won't even connect the dots. Like I once did a talk for church planners called The Spiritual Life of the Church Planner. And this was in 2009. In fact, it was a church planners conference that Tim Keller was at, and no one knew who I was, and they didn't think anyone would come to my talk. So they said, we're just going to put Tim Keller next to you, and you're going to give the talk, and he's just going to sit there so that people will come. It was for a shame-based guy like me, it was really painful. It was like, oh, what do I do with this? But I mentioned in passing, for instance, irritable bowel syndrome. And well, I had a lineup of people afterwards who I thought were going to ask profound questions, but they were like, what is this irritable bowel syndrome? And what I was saying was, in a sense, before, we were talking about it, was the body keeps the score. And what you'll begin to notice in your body is the irritable bowel, the heartburn, the sleeplessness, the headaches, the numbing disconnection from your body. You'll begin to experience in your emotions the disorientation, the shame, the sadness, the anger, in your thoughts, the judgmentalism, the scattered thoughts, the obsessiveness, and so on and on. And so that's part of it. Is those are the ones that sort of come up, and there are some that come up more than others. Oftentimes pastors will tell me, I feel a lot of anger these days, feeling really disconnected from people, like I don't want to have anything to do with anyone, and I can't really sleep at night, and I constantly feel like burning sensation in my chest. And they'll be like, okay, yep. In fact, I've known a lot of those things myself, so let's talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are signs of trauma accumulating in the body.
Yeah, they could be, like I want to pay attention to that, because, trauma, that's another word that we probably use and misuse or overuse, or maybe I think in some cases underuse. But, what we're talking about is this kind of accumulation of stress that over time sort of becomes solidified in a person, particularly when they don't have a compassionate witness, someone, caring for them. And we end up bearing it alone. And so, we're carrying around this stress. It accumulates in one's body. And in that engine beneath the dashboard, right, we go into a kind of survival mode. It's like there's a lot going on. And so I need to go into the sympathetic state of fight to be able to get through it. And I talk to people all the time who are like, I think I've been in fight for 10 years, which is a pretty good sign that your body is in trauma. Your body is shifted into a state that was meant to be temporary and to get you out of a jam, but you're stuck there in a sort of hyper aroused mode.
Yeah, and then that like depletes your adrenal system because your adrenalines are still
because your adrenaline, cortisol, it's firing all the time. So so a lot of folks who live there will end up shifting to a different state, in and out of a different state, which is what we call a dorsal state, which is a state of shutdown and fatigue, where it's like I go from on to off to go to I just want to shut down and sleep. And that can be dangerous, but as I talk to pastors and leaders and even spiritual directors, we can live here for years.
Yeah, I did a solo episode last year about the spirituality of the nervous system, and I talked about how like my early fundamentalist years gave me all these tools that activated my sympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
And then I was told not to trust any of the things that could activate my parasympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
You know, like meditation or mindfulness and all that. It's like, oh, that's Eastern, and it's, you know,
Yeah.
you can't trust it. You got to constantly be on vigil and guard, because the devil is like a, you know,
Yeah.
roaring lion ready to pounce on you. And it's like, and God's
Yeah.
about to come back and rapture everyone, and the world's about to end, and the Antichrist is about to rise. And like, I was just like reflecting on my early faith years, and like that, the whole early faith years was about keeping my nervous system on edge, even though I wasn't even in a leadership position. I was just, a kid or a teen in church. And it was like, you got to be on guard. You got to be constantly vigilant on all the time. And I started to notice, like, fundamentalism really is that activation of that nervous system. And then it just stays on, even when you're not in leadership mode, leading a church and doing all that kind of a stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, oftentimes when I experience people in a more fundamentalistic space, I see them operating out of a kind of fight response, which is a part of that sympathetic state, you know, and they're stuck there. And what happens is when you're stuck there, and you know this, that's your reality, and you see everything through that autonomic nervous system lens, and so you feel very righteous in your beliefs there, and it doesn't allow for much curiosity, because when your autonomic nervous system is in survival mode, there's no real capacity for connection or curiosity. And so I have a real, in one sense, a real understanding for people who find themselves stuck there, because I think it's a survival response. And what I'm curious about, I'm certainly frustrated by how that shows up and the impact on others, but I'm curious about, like, how did you get there? And why are you so stuck in that mode?
Yeah. I think I'm not sure why we have to get stuck in that mode just by default in the fundamentalist spaces, but I do see that there seems to be a lot of anger and vitriol in those spaces.
Yeah.
Where they need an enemy to fight. They need an enemy to label and then to go after, whether it's an ideal or the other, whoever that is.
Yeah.
And there's different spectrums, you know, of, you know, everyone else but our little church is going to hell versus, it's that religion or that people or that political group.
Yeah.
And it seems like in the West, in American, not even just church spaces, but now even political spaces, we've really latched on to these fundamentalist ideals, even religiousless ones, with like conservative or really progressive. We can get really fundamentalist with those and go on attack, and our nervous system is activated. Is this just a Western thing, or is this more of a human thing, do you think?
Oh yeah, I certainly think it's a human thing, because all of us have autonomic nervous systems. I just think it shows up culturally in different times and places with different content, you know. And so you rightly said, you know, you can sort of insert whatever. I mean, you could come from, you know, what seems to be a very righteous progressive space, or a very enlightened centrist space, you know. You can be a Calvinist or an Anabaptist. You can be an elephant or a donkey politically, right? Wherever you are, what we're talking about is a nervous system stuck in fight mode, and or enemy mode, you know. And so I think it's really important, and that's not to minimize a really good and wise and thoughtful engagement of ideas. You know, like, ideas are important, but I think we engage those ideas best when we're anchored in what we call our ventral vagal system, that's our parasympathetic system that allows us to be at rest and to be connected and to be curious and to be playful and to be grounded. You know, where we can engage ideas from that place with a sense of conviction. We can define, while at the same time being connected. And now I just switched into family systems mode, but it all sort of coheres in my brain, I guess, at some level. But only if we are in an autonomic place of grounding, of center, of calm, of presence. Otherwise, it's our survival system, and it's impossible to connect or be curious from that place.
Yeah. Well, when we get out of that place, a lot of people experience disillusionment in the church or in the faith, and it's oftentimes connected to leaving those traumatic experiences and then processing them and, going through that whole, what people call today, like the deconstruction of what was. How would that be similar to or different from Dark Night of the Soul?
Yeah. Well, oftentimes I think we're talking about a similar phenomenon, in the grand Venn diagram of life, right? I mean, the Dark Night of the Soul is pretty technical language, going back to St. John of the Cross, who you love and who I love, that gets at a spiritual phenomenon that has some overlap, I think, with deconstruction, right? I mean, there's a sense within the Dark Night that our religious addictions catch up to us, and what we thought was God, our small g gods, stop working for us, and it feels like God has left the building. And suddenly now it seems like we're deconstructing, because like, where's God? What happened? And it's not that God left, it's that our small g gods are dying, right? And that's the phenomenon of the Dark Night, I think, is so fascinating, because it's not necessarily about God leaving the building. In fact, St. John of the Cross assumes God's deep connection and union with us, but it is that those things that we idolized as small g gods don't work for us anymore, and it feels like God is left. I do tend to think of deconstruction a bit more as a more intellectual phenomenon. I know it's not merely that, but it's as we begin to ask questions, and maybe our small g gods of, well, I thought the Bible to be true had to be historical from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, right? And we begin to ask questions about the historicity of parts of Genesis or other parts of the Bible, or we begin to see contradictions here or there. Then we find ourselves disoriented in a different kind of way, and deconstructing our faith a little bit more intellectually. But I think these things go hand in hand. But I'd be curious, as the resident doctoral student or doctoral, you finished it. You're a doctor of liminality, I'll call you. How do you see these two?
There's 4 different dark nights of the soul.
Yeah, right.
There's passive and active. There's Dark Night of the Senses, Dark Night of the Soul.
That's right.
And they get really technical, and it's really hard for me to know like which is which.
What's happening when?
But I do know that just because you're going through a difficult time doesn't mean it's a Dark Night of the Soul.
That's exactly right.
It's really when you feel totally abandoned by God. You are becoming agnostic because your perceptions of God, the light switch went off. You have no perception of God whatsoever. Yeah. And as you said, God has left the building.
Yeah.
That seems to be the vocabulary of Dark Night.
Yeah. And of course, you just went to the 4 different kinds of dark nights, and so now everyone's like, "What in the world? There are 4 different dark nights."
There are. Buckle up. Oh, maybe we can just do a whole episode on Dark Nights of the Soul coming up here.
Seriously, yeah.
I feel like we just scratched the surface. We are out of time. You have an appointment coming up. How can people connect with your work, pre-order your book, and buy your previous work? Where do you want to send them?
Well, I guess probably the best place would be chuckdegroat.net is my website, and folks can go there and take a look at books and other resources. In fact, I've got a film there, contemporary of St. John of the Cross, and a good friend of his, St. Teresa of Avila, wrote the interior castle. So I've got a 1-hour film walking through the different dwellings of St. Teresa's interior castle as a kind of proto developmental psychology. So it's kind of a fun little film that I put together. People could see that. But I'm on different social media spaces where I do my best to just kind of dip my toe in the water every now and then, and not get sucked into the vortex. So Instagram, X, I'm at Chuck DeGroat.
All right. Well, I will put those things down in the notes so people can just click on them and find them really easily. And I think we need to have a couple more conversations about St. Teresa's mansions and John's Dark Night of the Souls. This sounds fun.
I think we're brothers from another mother, Tom.
I think so. Let's connect again, because this was
Yeah.
a lot of fun, and I just want to keep going, but we can't. So,
Oh, sounds good.
all right. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Liminal Living Podcast. This conversation with Chuck today was really powerful reminder of the importance of integrating our emotional and spiritual lives together. And Chuck's work is really challenging us to look beyond the surface, to engage deeply, even though it's difficult, and it's a work that's really necessary to do that work of inner transformation. As your curator of conversations, it's my hope today that this dialogue has inspired you to consider your own journey towards wholeness. So if you found this episode meaningful or helpful, please share it with others who might benefit from these insights. And don't forget to make sure you're subscribed to this podcast. Check out our YouTube page. Check us out on Facebook. We have a page there as well, so that you don't miss out on future episodes where we continue to explore the rich, complex, and often challenging spaces in between those liminal times. So until next time, I am Tom Rundell, encouraging you to embrace the journey, live in the questions, and keep exploring the liminal spaces of life. Peace out.